letter had already been signed. Eleanor Voss did not hesitate when she handed it to the solicitor. She had been waiting 7 years for this moment, and she had learned, over those long and difficult years, that hesitation was a luxury she could no longer afford. The solicitor took the document, glanced at it, and then looked up at her with wide eyes. She simply nodded and told him to proceed. The train that carried her back to Ashford moved through green fields and old stone bridges, and Eleanor sat by the window with her hands folded in her lap. Her coat was plain and dark, her shoes were sensible and worn at the heel, and the single briefcase she carried was not the kind that impressed anyone. She looked like a woman returning from a long and unremarkable trip. She looked like someone who had seen hard days and survived them without fanfare. The other passengers did not pay her any attention, and that was exactly the way she preferred it. Ashford was not a large town, but it had the particular kind of pride that small places often develop when one very powerful person decides to make it his home. Duke Harlan Ashford had lived in the great estate on the hill for his entire life, and the town had built itself around his presence, the way ivy builds itself around old stone. His name was on the library. His family had funded the church roof repairs. His photograph appeared in the local newspaper so regularly that the editor had a folder of approved images ready to use without asking. When Harlan Ashford sneezed, Ashford noticed. Eleanor had grown up knowing this. She had come to Ashford originally as a young woman with a sharp mind and a quiet manner, hired to do financial consulting work for a company connected to the Ashford estate. She had not come looking for anything other than good work and a fair wage. She had not expected to fall in love. She had not expected that the man she fell in love with would be Harlan Ashford himself, and she had certainly not expected that he would feel the same way, or say that he did, or pursue her with the kind of attention that made her believe every word he said. That had been 8 years ago. A great deal had happened since then. The train pulled into Ashford Station just after 2 in the afternoon. Eleanor stepped onto the platform and stood still for a moment, breathing the cool air. The station was the same as she remembered. The flower boxes on the platform wall had been repainted, and the old clock above the ticket office had been replaced with a newer one, but everything else was unchanged. A porter offered to help with her bag. She thanked him and said she was fine. When she walked through the station and out onto the main street, and turned left toward the inn that she had booked from the city 2 days before. She had chosen the inn deliberately. It was not the Grand Hotel near the town center, which was where people of consequence stayed when they visited Ashford. It was a smaller, quieter place on the edge of town, run by a woman named Audrey Crane who had operated it for 30 years, and who had a reputation for minding her own business. Eleanor had stayed there once before, in the early days of knowing Harlan, when she had been just a visiting consultant with no particular connection to the town. Audrey Crane had remembered her fondly when she called to make the reservation, which was a good sign. Some things in Ashford had not been poisoned by Harlan's version of events. The receptionist at the inn was a young woman named Poppy, perhaps 19 years old, with bright eyes and the habit of watching people carefully before she decided how to treat them. She looked at Eleanor when she arrived, took in the plain coat and the worn briefcase and the calm face, and handed her the room key with a small smile that suggested she had already made up her mind about something. Eleanor thanked her, carried her own bag upstairs, and sat down on the edge of the bed in her room. She did not unpack immediately. She opened the briefcase and took out the top folder, the one she had reviewed so many times over the past 3 months that the corners of the pages were beginning to soften. She read through it again, not because she needed to, but because reading it still brought her a steadiness that nothing else quite managed. The folder contained, among other documents, a copy of a loan agreement signed 11 years ago between a man named George Voss and the Ashford Estate Management Company. George Voss had been Eleanor's father. He had been a quiet and careful man, a businessman of modest origins who had spent 40 years building something solid and real out of nothing at all. He had died 4 years ago, leaving Eleanor everything he had built, including a company called Voss Capital Partners, and, within that company's records, a file that Eleanor had first read the night after his funeral, sitting alone in his home office with a cup of cold tea, and a growing sense that the world was stranger and more deliberately arranged than she had ever understood. She placed the folder back in the briefcase, closed it, and finally unpacked her bag. She hung her clothes in the wardrobe, set her toiletries on the bathroom shelf, and went downstairs to order tea. Poppy brought it to the small sitting room near the front window. Eleanor sat with her cup and looked out at the street. From where she was sitting, she could not see the Ashford estate, which sat on a hill at the northern edge of town behind a long drive lined with old oak trees, but she knew it was there. She had spent 3 years living in it. She knew every room, every corridor, every window that let in the morning light, and every corner that stayed cold no matter what the season. She had loved that house once. the way a person loves something that seems to belong to them. She had learned, in the cruelest possible way, that it had never belonged to her at all. Or so she had believed at the time. She sipped her tea and said nothing and waited. The news of her arrival reached Harlan Ashford before dinner that same day. It came to him through his estate manager, a thin and efficient man named Colin Drew, who had been with the estate for 12 years and who delivered information the way a doctor delivers test results, carefully and without visible emotion. Harlan was in his study reviewing proposals for a new wing on the east side of the house when Colin appeared in the doorway and informed him that Eleanor Voss had been seen arriving at Ashford Station that afternoon and was currently staying at Crane's Inn on the edge of town. Harlan looked up from his papers. He was 51 years old, lean and well-maintained, with silver at his temples and the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had to fight very hard for anything. He had the sort of face that photographed well, and the sort of manner that filled a room. People who did not know him well generally liked him immediately. People who knew him better often continued to like him, because he was skilled at making people feel that their discomfort was their own problem. He listened to Colin's report and then leaned back in his chair. He repeated Eleanor's name with her maiden name attached, the name she had used before she became his wife and then ceased to be, and the way he said it carried something in it that was not quite surprise and not quite amusement, but was something closer to contempt, dressed in the clothing of humor. He asked what on earth she could possibly want. Colin Drew said he did not know. Harlan said that whatever it was, it could be dealt with by the lawyers, and then he reached for his glass and went back to his papers, and that was all the thought he gave to it for the rest of that evening. The following morning, however, Harlan had a garden luncheon. It was the kind of event he hosted regularly, a gathering of perhaps 30 people drawn from the upper reaches of the county's social world, the sort of gathering where the right people said the right things, and everyone felt confirmed in their sense of their own importance. The weather was good, the food was excellent, and Harlan moved through his guests with the ease of a man who had never once questioned whether he was wanted. It was at this luncheon, about halfway through the afternoon, that the subject of Eleanor's return came up. It was raised by one of the guests, a woman named Diana Pallister who knew everything about everyone in Ashford and made no effort to pretend otherwise. Diana mentioned, while refilling her glass, that she had heard Eleanor Voss had come back to town and was staying at the little inn near the bottom road. She said it with the particular tone of a person who expects the comment to land with some weight. It did. Several of the guests turned to look at Harlan. Harlan smiled the smile that he always used when he wanted to signal that something was beneath him, but he was willing to be generous about it. He said, very clearly and very easily, so that everyone nearby could hear, "Eleanor? Back in Ashford? What does she want? A job?" Several people laughed. Harlan did not stop there. He went on in the same light, easy tone, describing his former wife as someone who had always had a talent for numbers but very little understanding of how the real world worked, calling her by a phrase that reduced her years of careful, skilled work to something small and mechanical, suggesting that she had probably come back because she had run out of money, and hoped that the sight of her face might soften someone's heart. The laughter grew. People added their own small comments. The whole exchange lasted perhaps 4 minutes, no more, and then the conversation moved on to other things, and the luncheon continued, and nobody thought much more about it, except that one of the guests had a phone in his pocket, and that phone was pointed at Harlan during approximately 1 minute and 40 seconds of that exchange, and that the footage, shot carelessly and without any particular plan, made its way onto a social media account that evening, because the guest thought it was funny and wanted to share the joke with a few friends. By the following morning, it had been viewed 11,000 times. By the evening of that day, the number was closer to 60,000. By the end of the week, it was a story that had spread well beyond Ashford, a short clip of a wealthy man mocking his former wife to a group of laughing guests, his voice comfortable and unhurried, his audience delighted. People who watched it had different reactions. Many laughed along, because the clip presented Harlan exactly as he presented himself, charming and witty and entirely sure of himself. Some found something uncomfortable in it that they could not quite name. A smaller number watched it and felt something else entirely, a cold and careful attention, the feeling of watching a man walk confidently across ice without knowing how thin it was. Eleanor was shown the clip by Poppy, the young receptionist at the inn, who had seen it on her phone that morning and brought it to Eleanor's attention with the shy and slightly apologetic manner of someone delivering unwelcome news, and she held out her phone and said she thought Eleanor should probably see it. Eleanor took the phone and watched the clip once, all the way through, without changing her expression. She could hear Harlan's voice clearly. She could hear the laughter of the guests. She could hear the ease of it all. the effortless comfort of a man who had never once imagined that the person he was mocking might be in a position to surprise him. She handed the phone back to Poppy, and she said, "Thank you," in a calm and ordinary voice. She picked up her tea. Poppy stood there for a moment, clearly expecting more, a reaction, anger, perhaps, or pain, or at least some visible sign that the clip had touched something in her. Eleanor gave her none of that, not because she felt nothing, but because what she felt was not something she intended to share in the sitting room of a small inn on a Tuesday morning. What she felt was a kind of quiet confirmation, the feeling of something she had always suspected being proven true in front of witnesses. She had known, even in the good years of the marriage, even when she had genuinely believed in what they had built together, that Harlan saw her in a particular way. And she had told herself it was not true. She had found reasons to believe she was wrong. The clip removed all doubt. It showed her exactly what she had been to him, not a partner, not someone he respected, not someone whose intelligence and skill and years of careful effort he valued, but a small joke that he was generous enough not to tell in front of her. She had spent 7 years building the answer to that joke. She had not known, when she started, that the answer would be quite as complete as it had turned out to be. That was the part that still surprised her sometimes, in quiet moments. Not what she had done, but how thoroughly the truth had arranged itself in her favor, without her having to manipulate a single thing. She finished her tea and went upstairs. She opened the briefcase. She took out a second folder, one she had not yet reviewed that morning, and she spread its contents carefully on the small desk by the window. Outside, the town of Ashford moved through its ordinary day. People walked past the inn. A delivery van parked across the street. 2 older women stood on the corner talking for a long time, their words carried away by the wind before they could reach the window where Eleanor sat working. The oak trees on the drive up to the Ashford estate were just visible on the hill above the rooftops, their branches dark against the pale sky. Eleanor looked at them once, then she looked back at her papers and kept working. She had an appointment at the land registry office the following morning. She had already confirmed it twice, and triple-checked the documents she would need to bring. Everything was in order. Everything had been in order for several months, but there was a kind of discipline in checking again, a habit she had built over years of working in environments where small errors became large disasters, where carelessness was not forgiven, and precision was the only currency that held its value. She was not nervous. That was the thing that might have surprised people who knew her history, the fact that she was not nervous at all. She had been nervous once, years ago, when she had first found the folder in her father's office and understood what it contained. She had been nervous for about 3 days. Then something in her had settled, the way a foundation settles when it has been properly laid, and the nervousness had simply stopped. She knew what was in the documents. She knew what they meant. She knew what the law said about the clause at the end of the loan agreement, and she had had it verified by 3 different solicitors before she trusted it fully. There was no uncertainty left in the matter. What remained was the meeting, the registry office, the official confirmation, and then whatever came after that. What came after was not something she spent a great deal of time imagining, not because she had no feelings about it, but because she had long since learned that imagining the future was less useful than preparing for it. She had prepared. She would attend the meeting, complete the process, and then see what happened next. She gathered the papers back into the folder, slipped the folder into the briefcase, and closed the latch. Outside the window, the afternoon light was beginning to shift toward evening. The oak trees on the hill were disappearing into the dimming sky. Eleanor stood up, stretched her arms, and went to the window for a moment. The town looked exactly as it always had, quiet and certain of itself, built around the confidence of one powerful man on a hill, settled into the easy assumption that nothing important would ever change. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she drew the curtain and went to prepare for the following day. George Voss had not been a man who talked about money. That was the first thing Eleanor had understood about her father when she was old enough to understand anything. Other fathers she knew, fathers of the girls she went to school with and the boys who lived on their street, talked about money constantly. They talked about what things cost and what they earned and whether it was enough and whether it would last. Money was a conversation in most families she knew, sometimes a difficult one and sometimes a proud one, but always present, always audible. In George Voss's house, money was a fact, like weather. It existed, it behaved according to certain rules. You understood those rules or you did not, and understanding them was useful, and not understanding them was dangerous, and that was all that needed to be said. George had taught Eleanor the rules when she was still very young, not in any formal way, not with lessons or lectures, but in the way that careful people teach the things they value most, by example, by quiet demonstration, by letting the child watch and ask questions and gradually absorb the shape of things. She had sat beside him at the kitchen table on weekend evenings while he reviewed his papers, and she had asked what the numbers meant, and he had always explained in plain language, without impatience, without making her feel that the question was too small, or that the answer was too complex for her to follow. She had been a quick learner. That was the honest version of it. She had understood financial structures and the logic of investment, and the difference between what something appeared to be worth and what it was actually worth, long before she had any formal education in the subject. When she eventually went to university and studied finance, she found that most of what she was being taught she had already grasped, in the way a person who has grown up beside the ocean grasps things about water without being able to name every principle that explains it. George Voss had built Voss Capital Partners over 30 years, starting with almost nothing. It was not a famous company. It was not the kind of firm that appeared in newspapers or had its name on buildings. It operated quietly, lending to businesses that needed capital, and could not always access it through conventional channels, structuring deals with careful attention to the long term, never overextending, never chasing quick returns at the cost of solid foundations. George was known among the small circle of people who knew him professionally as someone who could be trusted absolutely. A handshake from George Voss meant more than a signed contract from most other men. When Eleanor joined the firm after university, she brought her own skills into what her father had built, a sharper analytical edge, a broader understanding of market structures, a willingness to use new tools that George, who was then in his early 60s, was happy to let her explore. They worked well together. They did not always agree, and when they disagreed, they argued carefully, and then one of them changed their mind based on the merits of the other's position. And there was no pride involved in it, only the work. Those had been good years. Eleanor looked back on them now with a steady affection, the kind that had no pain in it because it was not touched by loss, only by the natural distance of time. It was in those years that she had first come to Ashford on consulting work. A property company connected to the Ashford estate had needed an outside review of its investment structure, and Voss Capital Partners had been engaged to provide one. George had sent Eleanor to do the initial assessment because she was excellent at this kind of work, and because he believed in letting capable people do capable things without standing over them. She had spent 3 weeks in Ashford that first visit, working out of a borrowed office in the town center, reviewing documents and meeting with the company's managers, and producing a thorough report that recommended a series of structural adjustments that would significantly improve the company's efficiency. The report had been well received. She had been asked to return the following month to assist with the implementation of several of her recommendations. It was during that second visit that she had met Harlan Ashford. He had not been part of the original engagement. The property company was managed by professionals who operated at a remove from Harlan himself, and there had been no expectation that the consulting work would bring her into contact with the Duke personally. But Harlan had a habit of knowing what was happening within the orbit of his estate, and one afternoon he had appeared unannounced at the office where Eleanor was working, introduced himself with the easy confidence of a man who expected to be recognized, and asked if she had time to explain what she was doing. She had explained it to him, clearly, precisely, without any attempt to make herself seem more impressive than the work required. She used plain language, because she found that plain language was almost always more useful than technical language when explaining financial structures to people who were not specialists. Harlan had listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, which surprised her, and had asked several questions that were sharper than she expected, which surprised her further. They had talked for nearly 2 hours. She had forgotten by the end of it that she was talking to someone important. That was not something that happened to her often with important people. He had invited her to dinner that evening. She had hesitated, because she was there to work and not to socialize, and because she had a careful habit of keeping those two things separate. But something in the conversation had made her want to continue it, and so she had accepted. Dinner had turned into a habit. The habit had turned into something that she did not immediately have a name for, and then she had a name for it but did not say it aloud for several weeks, and then she said it and he said it back, and the thing was what it was. She had not expected to be loved. She wanted to be clear about that. Even now, looking back with the full knowledge of what had come afterward, she had not gone to Ashford looking for love. She had not come into Harlan Ashford's orbit hoping for anything other than good professional work and a fair return on her expertise. The feeling that developed between them had not been something she had manufactured or encouraged or shaped toward any particular end. It had simply arrived, the way important things sometimes do, without invitation and without announcement. And she had trusted it. That was the part she returned to most often, not with regret exactly, but with the particular attention of someone who has learned a lesson they did not want to learn and must decide how to carry it. She had trusted it because she had been a careful and perceptive person her entire life. and she had believed that those qualities would protect her from serious mistakes. She had been wrong about that, as careful and perceptive people sometimes are, because there are forms of deception that are sophisticated enough to fool even the people most accustomed to looking clearly at things. Harlan had been genuinely charming, not in the surface way of people who practice charm as a skill, but in the deeper way of people who have a real gift for making others feel seen and valued. He had listened to Eleanor with what appeared to be authentic attention. He had engaged with her ideas, deferred to her expertise in the areas where her expertise was real, laughed at things she said in a way that did not feel performed. She had not imagined those things. She had reviewed her memories of them many times, looking for the error, and she was confident now that they had been real. What she had been wrong about was not whether they were real, but what they meant. They had married 14 months after they first met. The wedding was held at the estate, and it was beautiful. And Eleanor's father had stood beside her and held her hand and smiled at her in the way he always smiled when he was genuinely happy, with his whole face and without reserve. She had felt, standing there, that she was at the beginning of the right thing. She had felt that the careful life she had built was expanding into something larger and better, and that the expansion was deserved. For the prenuptial agreement had been presented 3 weeks before the wedding. Harlan's lawyers had drawn it up and delivered it with a covering letter, explaining that it was standard practice for families with significant assets. Eleanor had read it, understood most of it, noted the clauses that seemed restrictive, and had then made the decision that she later understood was the most consequential mistake of her life. She had not hired an independent solicitor to review it on her behalf. She had told herself she understood it well enough, that she trusted Harlan, that the agreement was a formality, and that formalities did not require the same level of scrutiny as real decisions. She had signed it, and in doing so she had given up, in the event of a divorce, almost every financial protection that a fair agreement would have provided. She had not known that at the time, or rather, she had known it the way a person knows something they are choosing not to look at directly. Later, she would be honest with herself about that. The first year of the marriage had been, by any reasonable measure, a good year. She had continued working for Voss Capital Partners, spending some days in the city and some days at the estate, balancing the two lives with her usual careful organization. She had also, almost immediately, begun to see problems in Harlan's business holdings that he seemed either unaware of or unwilling to address. 2 of his investment vehicles were losing ground in ways that would accelerate if nothing changed. She identified the problems, proposed solutions, and spent several months implementing those solutions at Harlan's request. Oh, the turnaround was significant. The company stabilized and then began to grow. Harlan told his associates that he had made some smart adjustments. No mention was made of Eleanor's role. She had let that go. She had told herself it was not important, that the work was what mattered, and that recognition was a secondary concern. She had believed that, genuinely, because she was not someone who worked for credit. She worked because the work itself was worth doing. But as the months passed, she began to notice other things, small things, individually dismissible but accumulating. The way Harlan's mother spoke to her at family occasions, with a particular careful coldness that was never overtly rude, but never let Eleanor forget that she was considered an outsider. The way Harlan's social circle treated her opinions in conversation, listening politely and then turning to the next topic, as though what she had said was a pleasant enough interruption and nothing more. The way Harlan himself, in company, would sometimes not defend her when she was dismissed, would let the dismissal pass with a comfortable silence that was indistinguishable from agreement. She began, quietly and without telling anyone, to pay closer attention, not because she suspected anything specific, but because she had been trained by her father and by her own experience to take careful stock of situations that did not feel entirely right, to look at the numbers, to compare what was being presented with what was actually present. What she found, over the following year, did not break her heart in one moment. It was more gradual than that. It arrived in pieces, and each piece was easier to dismiss on its own than it was to dismiss in the context of all the others. And by the time she had accumulated enough pieces to form a complete picture, she understood that the picture was not one she could live with. Harlan had not been faithful. She discovered this, not through drama, but through the methodical attention she had always brought to facts. She did not confront him immediately. She confirmed what she had found. She gave it time. She watched for evidence that she might be wrong, that the picture might rearrange itself into something less clear. It did not. When she finally spoke to him about it, she did it privately, calmly, and directly. She told him what she had found and what she believed it meant, and what she thought they needed to do. She did not raise her voice. She was not theatrical about it. She told him that she was willing to discuss whether the marriage could continue on different terms, or whether it was better for both of them to acknowledge what it had become and address that honestly. Harlan's response was not what she expected. She had expected, perhaps, defensiveness or regret or some form of the complexity that real people in real situations generally bring to moments like that. Instead, he had been very smooth about it, almost immediately organized. He had said that he appreciated her honesty and that he had been thinking the same thing, and that he would have his lawyers contact her solicitors to begin the separation process. She had realized, in that moment, that he had already planned this, not in a conspiratorial sense, not as a trap, but in the sense that a man who values control prepares his exit before he needs it. The lawyers had been ready. The process had moved quickly and efficiently. The prenuptial agreement had been invoked. And 4 months later, Eleanor had left the Ashford estate with a modest settlement and a quiet instruction, delivered through legal channels, that she not speak publicly about the circumstances of the marriage or its end. She had not spoken publicly, not because she feared him, but because she had nothing to say, at the time. She had gone to the city. She had returned to Voss Capital Partners. She had thrown herself into work with the focused intensity of someone who has been reminded that work does not disappoint the way people can. Her father had been alive then, and she had spent long evenings at his kitchen table again, not talking about the marriage or the divorce or any of it, just working beside him the way she had when she was young, letting the numbers be simple and clear and honest, in the way that numbers always are. George had died 2 years later. Eleanor had sat in his home office the night of the funeral, alone, sorting through his papers because she needed something to do with her hands, and in a filing cabinet in the corner of the room, in a drawer labeled with a year that she recognized as the year before Harlan's father had died, she had found the folder. She had read it 3 times before she trusted that she was reading it correctly. Then she had made herself a cup of tea, carried it back to the desk, and read it a 4th time. The loan agreement, the terms, the clause, the conversion provision that turned an unpaid debt into a property claim, under specific legal conditions, after a period of 10 years. Eleanor had sat with that information for a long time, not planning, not calculating, just sitting with the shape of it, the way it changed the landscape of everything she had believed was fixed and settled. She had not acted immediately. She was not that kind of person. She had taken the folder to a solicitor the following week, explained the situation without revealing her identity at first, and asked for a legal analysis of the document. The solicitor had provided one. She had taken that analysis to a second solicitor and asked the same questions, and then a third. All 3 had arrived at the same conclusion. Then she had put the folder in her briefcase and carried on with her work for another 4 years. She had continued to build Voss Capital Partners. She had expanded the firm's investment portfolio. She had added staff and developed new expertise, and grown the company into something substantially larger than what her father had handed to her. She had not been thinking about Harlan during those 4 years. Or rather, she had been thinking about him the way she thought about all complicated historical facts, as something that had happened and had its place in the record and did not require constant attention. She was not waiting for the right moment in the dramatic sense. She was simply doing what she had always done, being precise, being prepared, letting the process move at the pace the process required. The 10-year mark had been approaching for the past year. She had revisited the documents. She had confirmed, with a 4th solicitor and then a 5th, that the conversion clause was still valid and had not been superseded by any subsequent legal changes. She had confirmed that Harlan had made no attempt to settle the debt, which she had not expected him to do, because she had long suspected that he did not know about it. She had confirmed that the estate was still in Harlan's name, unencumbered by any other claims. Everything had aligned, not because she had forced it to, but because she had been patient enough to let it move at its own pace. And so she had taken the train back to Ashford with her briefcase and her plain coat and her worn shoes, and she had checked into the small inn and ordered her tea, and she had let the town know she was there without making any announcement at all. And Harlan had laughed. He had laughed in his garden in front of 30 guests and called her his little bookkeeper and suggested she had come back because she had run out of options. She had let him laugh, because in the folder in her briefcase was a document that would, within the next 48 hours, confirm that the ground beneath the Ashford estate, all 4,000 acres of it, the fields and the drive and the house on the hill and the oak trees she could see from her window, had not belonged to Duke Harlan Ashford for the past 11 years. It had belonged to a small holding company called Voss Capital Partners, which meant, now that George was gone and Eleanor had inherited everything he had left, that it belonged to the woman he had just called his little bookkeeper, sitting quietly in the sitting room of a small inn at the edge of town, drinking her tea. The morning of the registry appointment, Eleanor woke before her alarm. This was not unusual for her. She had always been someone who woke early on important days, not from anxiety, but from a kind of readiness, the body's way of signaling that it understood something significant was approaching and had decided to be alert for it. She lay still in the dark for a few minutes, listening to the sounds of the inn settling around her, the creak of the building in the early wind, the distant sound of a car on the road below. Then she got up, dressed carefully, made sure every document in her briefcase was in order, and went downstairs to ask for tea before the kitchen officially opened. Audrey Crane, the inn's owner, was already in the kitchen when Eleanor appeared at the door. She was a compact woman in her mid-60s with short gray hair and the practical, unhurried manner of someone who has run a small establishment for a long time and learned to anticipate everything without being surprised by anything. She looked at Eleanor, asked no questions, and put the kettle on. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table while the tea was made. Audrey set a cup in front of her and then went back to her own work without making conversation. This was, Eleanor reflected, one of the more underrated qualities a person could have. She reached the land registry office at 20 minutes to 9. The office did not open until 9, and there was a brief time when she stood on the pavement outside with her briefcase and looked at the building, which was ordinary and modest, a converted shopfront on the high street, with frosted glass in the lower half of the windows and a small brass nameplate beside the door. There was nothing about it that suggested it was a place where important things happened. That was true of most places where important things happened. At 9 o'clock precisely, a woman in a gray cardigan unlocked the door from the inside and pushed it open. She was perhaps 60, with careful eyes behind round glasses, and a manner that suggested she took her work seriously, without making a display of it. Her name badge, said Mrs. Colton. She looked at Eleanor, looked at the briefcase, and stood back to let her in. Eleanor introduced herself and said she had an appointment at 9 to review the deed history of the Ashford estate property. Mrs. Colton confirmed the appointment, led her to a desk near the back of the office, and asked her to wait while she pulled the relevant records. The office was quiet. There was one other member of staff present, a young man at a computer near the front who did not look up. Outside, the high street was beginning its morning activity. People walking past, a delivery being made to the shop next door, a dog pulling against its lead while its owner talked on the telephone. Mrs. Colton returned with a box of files and set them on the desk beside Eleanor. She then asked if Eleanor could show her the documentation she had brought. Eleanor opened the briefcase and laid the documents on the desk in the order she had prepared them. There was the original loan agreement, 12 pages, signed by George Voss and by Harlan Ashford's father, the late Edward Ashford, and witnessed by a solicitor whose firm had since been absorbed into a larger one, but whose records were fully traceable. There was the registered documentation of Voss Capital Partners, showing the company's legal history including Eleanor's inheritance of the controlling stake following her father's death. There was the clause, clearly printed in the loan agreement, specifying the conversion terms and the 10-year window. There was a legal analysis prepared by a senior solicitor in the city, confirming the clause's validity under current property law. There was a second analysis from a different firm, arriving at the same conclusion. There was a time-stamped record showing that no repayment of the loan had been made after the initial 3 installments in the first 2 years following the agreement's signing, and that communication from the Ashford estate management had ceased entirely following the death of Edward Ashford. Eleanor laid these documents in front of Mrs. Colton and said nothing. Mrs. Colton read slowly and carefully. She was the kind of reader who gave every page its full attention, moving her eyes across each line as though she understood that speed was not the relevant quality here. She read the loan agreement in full. She read both legal analyses. She cross-referenced dates against the registry records she had pulled from the box. She went back to the conversion clause and read it twice. Then she set down the papers and looked at Eleanor over the top of her glasses. She asked, in a carefully neutral voice, whether Eleanor was aware of the potential scope of what she was presenting. Eleanor said that she was. Mrs. Colton was quiet for a moment. She then said that she needed to make a phone call and asked Eleanor to wait. She stood, picked up several of the documents, carried them to a back office, and closed the door behind her. Eleanor waited. She did not check her phone. She did not fidget with the papers remaining on the desk. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the frosted glass in the lower half of the front window, the shapes of people moving past on the other side, indistinct and ordinary, going about their Tuesday in the usual way. The phone call lasted 9 minutes. She counted them, not from anxiety but from habit. After 9 minutes, Mrs. Colton returned. She set the documents back on the desk and sat down across from Eleanor. Her expression had not changed dramatically, but something in it had shifted, the particular shift of a professional who has confirmed something they half expected and is now in the territory of doing their job very carefully. Mrs. Colton said that she had consulted with her senior colleague and that the documentation appeared to be in order. She said that the conversion clause, if the conditions had been met as described, would need to be reviewed under a formal legal process before any change to the registered title could be completed, but that she could see no immediate grounds on which the documentation would be found invalid. She said that she would be issuing Eleanor with a formal acknowledgement of receipt, and that the next steps would involve the estate's current registered owner being notified. Eleanor nodded and said that she understood the process. She said that her solicitors were already prepared to manage the formal proceedings and that she simply wanted the registry's initial confirmation that the documentation had been received and reviewed. Mrs. Colton stamped 3 documents. She made copies of everything Eleanor had brought. She arranged the copies into a file, clipped them together, and placed the file on her desk where it sat with a quiet authority, a small collection of papers that contained within it something very large. She handed Eleanor back the originals, along with a receipt and a formal acknowledgement on registry letterhead. Eleanor thanked her, placed everything carefully in the briefcase, and stood. She walked back out through the office, past the young man at the computer who still did not look up, and pushed through the door onto the high street. The morning was clear and cool. She stood on the pavement for a moment with her briefcase in her hand and breathed the air. Around her, the town continued its Tuesday in the way that towns do, without drama and without particular awareness of anything unusual. No one on the high street knew what had just happened in the registry office. No one looked at her twice. She walked back toward the inn without hurrying. There was still a great deal to be done. The formal legal process would take weeks, possibly months. There would be challenges and counter-challenges and meetings and filings and all the careful mechanical work of law moving at its own deliberate pace. He knew this. She had prepared for it with the same methodical attention she had brought to everything else. But the acknowledgement was in her briefcase. The documents had been received and reviewed. The process had officially begun. And the thing that had been true for 11 years in the records of a loan agreement in a filing cabinet, the quiet and unannounced fact of it, the fact that Harlan Ashford had been living in a house that did not belong to him and had no idea, that fact had now been seen by official eyes and was in official hands. She stopped at the bakery on the corner and bought a small pastry and ate it while she walked. It was good. She finished it before she reached the inn and folded the paper bag neatly and found a bin. Poppy was at the front desk when she arrived back. She looked at Eleanor with the same careful attention she had shown since the first day. This young woman who watched people without intruding, who had seemed from the beginning to understand more about what was happening than anyone had told her. She looked at the briefcase and then at Eleanor's face. Eleanor gave her a small, genuine smile, the first one she had offered since she arrived. Poppy seemed to understand that it meant something. She said she would bring fresh tea to the sitting room. Eleanor thanked her and went in, set the briefcase on the table in front of her, and sat down in her usual chair by the window. Outside, the oak trees on the hill were visible again in the morning light, the long drive that led up to the Ashford estate, cutting a straight line through the green. The legal notification letter to Harlan Ashford's office would be sent that afternoon. She had asked her solicitors to prepare it and hold it until she confirmed that the registry appointment had gone as expected. She would send them a message when she got to her room. They would send the letter. And Harlan would receive it, perhaps today, perhaps tomorrow, through his estate manager or his personal assistant or whichever of the several people who managed the flows of information into his life happened to pick it up first. She thought about what his face might look like when he read it. She did not spend long on the thought. It was not what she was here for. What she was here for had already been accomplished, in a quiet room on a Tuesday morning, with documents and stamps and a phone call and a receipt on official letterhead. The rest of it was process. She poured her tea when Poppy brought it and held the warm cup in both hands and looked out the window at the hill. The Ashford estate sat up there in the autumn light exactly as it always had, solid and old and surrounded by its 4,000 acres of fields and trees, looking as permanent as anything in the world. It did not look any different from the outside, but the ground beneath it had shifted. Harlan Ashford prided himself on keeping a calm household. He used that phrase himself when he spoke to guests or gave the occasional interview to the local press, mentioning in passing that he believed a well-run estate was a reflection of a clear and ordered mind. He set the tone, he said, and the tone was one of measured confidence. Things at the Ashford estate were managed before they became problems. Surprises were minimized. The unpleasant was addressed swiftly and put behind one without unnecessary dwelling. This was why the 43-page letter, when it arrived, was so disturbing not just in its content, but in the simple fact of its arriving at all. It came on a Thursday morning, delivered by a firm of solicitors Eleanor had retained. a city practice that Harlan had never encountered before. This was itself notable. Harlan's world was one where he generally knew who the players were. He had worked with enough legal professionals over the years to have a sense of the landscape, to know which firms handled what kinds of work and who their clients tended to be. Voss and Partners was not a name he recognized. The covering letter was brief and formal and contained a line that he read 3 times before he set it down. It said that Voss Capital Partners, whose controlling interest was held by Eleanor Jane Voss, wished to bring to his attention a matter relating to the property commonly known as the Ashford Estate, and that the enclosed documentation would provide the relevant background. Harlan put the covering letter down on his desk. He did not immediately open the attached documents. He sat for a moment in his study, which was a large and comfortable room with high ceilings and walls lined with the kinds of books that suggest a cultivated mind, whether or not they have been read, and he thought about Eleanor Voss. He had not thought about her seriously since she had left, not because the subject was painful, but because it had not seemed worth his attention. The divorce had been handled. She had gone. The whole chapter had closed with the neat finality of a well-managed transaction. The clip of him at the luncheon had circulated more widely than he had expected. He was aware of this, mildly. His assistant had shown him the view count, and he had shrugged and said that people watched a lot of nonsense online, and that it would be forgotten by the weekend. It had not been entirely forgotten by the weekend, but it had diminished, as these things did, and he had moved on. Now he picked up the attached documents and began to read. He was not someone who panicked easily. This was, in fairness to him, a genuine quality rather than a performed one. He had been in difficult situations before, in business and in the management of a complicated estate, and in the ordinary pressures of a life lived at a level of public visibility that came with its own particular stresses. He had learned to read trouble calmly, and to assess it before reacting. He applied this discipline to the letter. He read the first 20 pages before he picked up his phone. He called his primary solicitor, a man named Philip Oakes who had handled Ashford estate matters for 15 years, and who answered his phone with the kind of assured steadiness that was part of what Harlan paid him for. Harlan said he had received a legal communication that he wanted Oakes to look at immediately. Oakes said he would come within the hour. Harlan set down the phone and went to the window. He stood there looking out at the grounds of the estate, the lawns running down toward the old stone wall, the fields beyond, the trees that had stood there for longer than any living member of the Ashford family could remember. He had grown up with this view. It had been the background of his entire life. He had never, not once, thought of it as something that could be taken from him. He was not entirely sure, even now, reading what he had read, that he believed it could be. There had to be something wrong with the documents. Some flaw in the clause, some error in the chain of ownership, some legal principle that would make the whole thing collapse when a proper expert looked at it. Things like this did not simply happen. You did not find out on a Thursday morning that your estate had belonged to someone else for 11 years. Philip Oakes arrived and read the documents with the slow, careful attention of a man who understood that speed was not his friend in a situation like this. He read without commenting. Harlan sat across from him and watched his face and tried to read it, which was difficult because Oakes had spent 40 years cultivating an expression that gave nothing away. When Oakes finished, he set the documents down and removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Harlan asked what he thought. Oakes said that he would need to involve a specialist in property law, and that he could not give a fully formed opinion without that consultation. But he said, carefully and in the precise language of a man who was aware of exactly what he was saying, that the documents appeared to have been competently prepared, that the loan agreement on which they were based appeared to be genuine, and that the conversion clause, on a first reading, was not obviously invalid. Harlan was quiet for a moment, then he asked Oakes whether he was familiar with the loan agreement in question. Oakes said that he was not. The agreement predated his involvement with the estate by several years. Harlan asked who would have been involved in the agreement at the time. Oakes said that the estate's legal affairs in that period had been handled by a different firm, one that had since closed, and that the relevant files would have been transferred but would need to be located and reviewed. Harlan stood up and walked to the window again. The grounds looked exactly as they always did, solid, permanent, on his. He asked Oakes, very quietly and very directly, whether it was possible that the document was legitimate and that the clause was enforceable. Oakes said, with the same precision, that until he had done further research he could not say that it was not. This was a different kind of answer from what Harlan had hoped for. He had hoped for immediate reassurance, for a quick professional dismissal of the thing, for Oakes to say that this sort of claim was common and would come to nothing. Oakes had not said that. Oakes had said something considerably less reassuring, while being very careful not to say anything he could not support. Harlan turned away from the window. He told Oakes to find the old files, engage the property law specialist that afternoon, and call him with a preliminary assessment before the end of the day. After Oakes left, Harlan stood alone in his study for a time. The house was quiet around him. The staff were about their work in other parts of the building. Cecile, his second wife, was in the city for the week visiting friends. The dogs were somewhere out in the grounds with the groundskeeper. He was alone in a room full of his family's things, in a house on a hill that bore his family's name. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt the particular discomfort of a man who is not sure of something he has always been sure of. He picked up the documents and reread the conversion clause. It was clear and plainly written, not buried or obscured, not hidden in technical language. It stated that if the principal plus agreed interest was not repaid in full within 10 years of the signing date, the lender would have the right to exercise a claim of ownership over the property listed as collateral, which was described in precise legal terms as the estate, commonly known as the Ashford Estate, its land, buildings, and attached properties, as registered at the county land registry. The signing date was 11 years ago. Harlan set the documents down. He thought about his father. Edward Ashford had been a man of considerable pride and considerable difficulty, someone who had built the family's reputation on an impression of financial solidity that was not always matched by the underlying reality. Harlan had known, in a general way, that his father had made poor decisions in the final decade of his life. There had been losses, adjustments, periods of uncomfortable tightness in the estate's finances that Harlan had been aware of without investigating closely. His father had not invited investigation. He had managed things himself, in his own way, and then he had died, and Harlan had inherited the estate and the title and what he believed was a clean slate. He had never looked closely at the liabilities his father had carried. He understood now, with a slow and difficult clarity, that he should have. The phone call from Oakes came at 6 that evening. The preliminary review by the property law specialist had confirmed that the loan agreement appeared to be an authentic registered document, and that the conversion clause was, under current law, likely to be enforceable if the conditions had been met. Oakes said likely with some care, but he said it. Harlan asked about grounds for challenge. Oakes said that there were several potential angles, including questions about proper notification and whether the terms of the original loan had included adequate communication to subsequent estate holders following the original signatory's death. He said these were worth pursuing, but that he would be less than honest if he presented them as strong grounds. He said the most significant challenge would be around the question of whether Voss Capital Partners had made reasonable efforts to communicate the debt to the estate following Edward Ashford's death, and that this would depend on records that had not yet been reviewed. Harlan ended the call and sat in his dark study for a long time. He thought about the luncheon. He thought about the clip. He thought about the ease with which he had laughed, the way his voice had sounded in the recording, comfortable and amused and entirely unaware. He thought about the woman who had been the subject of that laughter, sitting in her room at the inn at the bottom of the road, with her plain coat and her worn shoes and her briefcase. He had called her his little bookkeeper, in front of 30 guests, and the guests had laughed. He thought about this for longer than he meant to. Then he called his assistant and told her to arrange a meeting with Oakes and the property specialist for the following morning, first thing, and to clear his diary for the rest of the week. He went to bed late and slept badly, which was unusual for him. In the morning he was up before dawn. He stood at the window of his bedroom and watched the light come up over the fields, the long, slow brightening that turned the grass from black to gray to green. The oak trees on the drive were still dark against the pale sky. He had looked at this view every morning of his life. It was as natural to him as breathing. He stood at the window for a long time and said nothing, and thought nothing he was ready to put into words. Then he went downstairs to prepare for the morning's meetings. The morning meeting lasted 4 hours. It took place in Harlan's study, with Oakes and the property specialist, a man named Christopher Hale who had spent 30 years working exclusively on disputed property claims, and who brought to the room a particular kind of flat, unemotional expertise that Harlan found simultaneously reassuring and deeply unsettling. Hale was the kind of man who told you what was true rather than what you wanted to hear, and he did it without any visible concern for how the truth might land. Harlan sat at his desk and listened while Hale worked through the documentation systematically. The loan agreement was genuine. This was not in question. The signatures had been verified. The witnessing solicitor's records were traceable. The registration of the document was confirmed. Edward Ashford had entered into a legitimate financial arrangement with George Voss, and it had been properly recorded. This part was settled. The conversion clause was unusual but not exceptional. Hale had seen similar provisions in loan agreements of that era. particularly those involving private lending to families with significant property assets but limited liquid capital. The clause was clear in its terms, and there was no apparent ambiguity about its meaning or application. Whether it had been fair was a separate question from whether it was enforceable, and Hale said this in a tone that indicated the first question was not really his concern. The outstanding question was notification. Harlan's strongest potential challenge was the argument that Voss Capital Partners had failed to adequately notify the estate of the outstanding debt following Edward Ashford's death, and that this failure had denied the estate the opportunity to remedy the situation before the conversion clause came into effect. This was worth pursuing legally, but Hale said, with the same flat precision, that it was not a guaranteed success. The original agreement included provisions for the debtor to maintain records of the debt and ensure it was communicated to any successor estate holder. In other words, the responsibility for ensuring the debt was known and managed was placed on the borrower's side, not the lender's. Harlan asked whether there was any way to argue that he had not known about the debt, and that this created grounds for relief. Hale said that not knowing about a debt one had inherited did not, under property law, generally constitute grounds for voiding the creditor's claim, particularly when the original agreement had placed the communication responsibility on the debtor. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he asked what the strongest realistic outcome was if they contested the claim. Hale said that the strongest realistic outcome was a negotiated settlement. He said that outright defeating the claim in court was possible but would require either finding a flaw in the documentation that was not currently visible, or successfully arguing the notification challenge, which he rated as uncertain. He said that these things often moved toward negotiation, because full litigation over disputed property claims was expensive, time-consuming, and unpredictable, and that the party with the stronger documentation, which at present appeared to be Eleanor Voss, had every reason to be patient, while the party with the weaker position bore the cost and anxiety of the process. Harlan looked at the window. He did not look at the view this time. He looked at the glass itself, the way the morning light came through it. He asked Oakes, very quietly, what Eleanor would actually want from a negotiation. Oakes said he did not yet know. He said that the solicitors representing Eleanor had not communicated anything beyond the legal notice, and that the next step would be to make contact and establish what her position was. Harlan said he wanted that contact made that day. Oakes confirmed that he would reach out that afternoon. After the meeting ended and the two solicitors left, Harlan's estate manager, Colin Drew, appeared in the doorway of the study to ask whether Harlan needed anything. Harlan looked at him and said that he was fine, thank you, and that he would not be taking any meetings for the rest of the day. Colin Drew nodded and withdrew, with the expressionless efficiency that Harlan had always valued in him, and which now, for the first time, felt slightly unsettling. He wondered, briefly, how much Colin knew. Colin knew everything that happened in the estate, as a rule. It was how he did his job. But he said nothing about things he was not asked, which was also how he did his job, and so Harlan could not tell from looking at him what he understood about the situation. Harlan spent the afternoon alone. He reviewed the documents himself, for the third time, without his solicitors present. He wanted to read them without someone else's interpretation layered over the top, to form his own understanding of what was actually on the pages. What was on the pages was, as Hale had said, clear. He thought about his father. He thought about what it had been like in those years before Edward Ashford died, the meetings he had been kept out of, the discussions that stopped when he entered rooms, the sense he had sometimes had that things were being managed in ways he was not supposed to see. He had attributed this, at the time, to his father's general preference for keeping control of his own affairs. Edward Ashford had been someone who did not share information easily, who believed that authority resided in the person who held the most knowledge. Harlan understood now that the thing his father had been keeping from him was probably a great deal worse than he had imagined. The failing business ventures, the pressure on the estate's finances, and then the decision to take a private loan from a man he had likely considered far beneath his social level, a tradesman from the city, a quiet businessman with no title and no family name of consequence. Harlan could picture his father signing that agreement. He could picture the mixture of relief and contempt that Edward Ashford would have brought to the act, the sense that he was solving a problem in the short term, without fully accepting the reality of the long term. Harlan had inherited so many things from his father: the title, the house, the grounds, the social position, the easy confidence in his own importance. He had not looked closely at what else he had inherited: the debts, the decisions made badly and left unaddressed, the agreements signed in private and buried in filing cabinets. He was looking closely now. Later in the afternoon, he received a call from Oakes, who said that Eleanor's solicitors had confirmed that their client was willing to consider a negotiated settlement and would agree to one meeting. The meeting would take place at a solicitor's office in town, on neutral ground, and would involve representatives from both sides. Eleanor herself would attend. Harlan could attend if he wished. Harlan said he would attend. That evening, for the first time since the letter arrived, Harlan called Cecile in the city. She was at a dinner when he called and could not speak properly, but she excused herself and went into a quieter room, and he told her, in broad terms, what was happening. He did not give her all the detail. He gave her enough. She was quiet while he spoke. She asked whether it was serious. He said that it appeared to be. She was quiet again. Then she said she would come back the following day. He thanked her. He meant it. He said good night and sat for a while longer with his phone in his hand in the quiet study. In the house on the hill, in the grounds that had his family's name on them, and that he now understood might not have his family's name on them for much longer, depending on what the woman in the small inn at the bottom of town decided to do. He had laughed at her 10 days ago. He had done it easily and without consideration, in front of people who had laughed along, in a garden full of good food and warm afternoon light, and the comfortable assumption that his world was exactly as he had always believed it to be. He did not feel amused now. What he felt was something considerably more complicated than amusement, a gathering of feelings that he did not have an easy name for, and that he was not accustomed to sitting with. There was anger in it, not at Eleanor specifically, but at the situation, at the history, at his father's silence and its consequences. There was something that resembled embarrassment, which was a feeling Harlan encountered rarely and found deeply uncomfortable. There was, underneath all of it, something that he could only call a kind of unwilling recognition, the slow and resistant acknowledgement that the person he had dismissed was not, and had never been, what he had made her out to be. He set his phone down. He was a man who had spent his entire life in a position of certainty about his place, his rights, his understanding of how the world was arranged. That certainty had been comfortable. It had been convenient. It had allowed him to move through his days with an ease that he had taken entirely for granted. It was a strange and unfamiliar sensation, to sit in the middle of that certainty and feel it shift. He sat with it for a long time. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep particularly well, but he lay in the dark and let the feelings be what they were and did not try to manage them, which was not his usual approach but which seemed, tonight, to be the only one available. Until the meeting was in 3 days. He would prepare for it carefully. He would listen to his solicitors and engage seriously with what was possible, and not waste time on what was not. And he would look, when he sat across from Eleanor Voss, at the person he had not, in 8 years of knowing her, ever fully looked at. It was the least he could do. It was, he was beginning to understand, the bare minimum. The solicitor's office where the meeting was held was on a street 2 blocks from the high street, a building that had originally been a house, and still had something domestic about its proportions, with sash windows and a small front garden and a brass plate by the door that listed 3 names. The room they used was on the ground floor, furnished with a long table and 8 chairs and a sideboard with a water jug and glasses arranged on it. There was a framed watercolor on one wall, a view of fields and nothing else decorative. It was a room designed for purpose and nothing beyond it. Eleanor arrived first. She came with 2 solicitors from her firm, a senior partner named Diane Foster who had handled the formal legal process since Eleanor had engaged the firm, and a younger colleague who was there primarily to manage documents. They arranged themselves on one side of the table. Eleanor sat in the middle, with her briefcase on the floor beside her chair. She poured herself a glass of water and waited. Harlan arrived 8 minutes later with 3 people. Oakes, who Eleanor recognized, and Christopher Hale, who she had expected. The third was a younger woman she did not recognize who was introduced as Harlan's personal assistant. Harlan himself entered the room last. He was dressed in a dark suit, which he wore well, in the way that men who have been measured for their clothes since childhood generally do. He looked like himself, which was to say he looked polished and composed. But Eleanor was a careful observer, and she noticed things. She noticed the slight tightness around his jaw that was not visible to people who did not know his face well. She noticed that he did not look at her immediately when he entered the room, which was itself significant, because Harlan Ashford generally looked at people immediately and held the look with easy confidence. She noticed that when he did look at her, a moment after he sat down, his expression had something in it that was not the smooth authority she remembered. It was something more cautious than that, something more real. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at Diane Foster, who indicated she was ready to begin. The first hour was formal and careful. The 2 legal teams established the positions on record, confirmed the documentation on both sides, and worked through the areas of agreement and disagreement in the way that legal teams do, methodically and without unnecessary drama. Harlan's team raised the notification challenge. Eleanor's team responded with the provisions of the original agreement that placed the communication responsibility on the borrower's side. This exchange was conducted without heat, in the measured language of professionals who understand that being heard is more important than being emphatic. Harlan sat through this largely without speaking. He was composed. Eleanor granted him that. Whatever he was feeling about the situation, and she had a reasonably clear sense of what that might be, he was not allowing it to make him foolish. He listened. He consulted quietly with Oakes at moments when something needed clarification, and he did not try to bluster his way through the legal analysis. The notification challenge was the strongest card his team held, and they played it carefully. Harlan's position was that following Edward Ashford's death, the estate had not received any formal communication from Voss Capital Partners regarding the outstanding debt, and that this failure had effectively prevented the estate from having the opportunity to resolve the debt before the conversion clause was triggered. The argument was that the clause could not fairly be enforced when the debtor's successors had no knowledge of the debt's existence. Eleanor's legal team had prepared for this. Diane Foster presented a series of communication records showing that Voss Capital Partners had sent written notice to the Ashford Estate Management address on 3 separate occasions following Edward Ashford's death, at intervals of approximately 18 months. The letters had been sent by recorded delivery and had received confirmation of receipt on 2 out of 3 occasions. The fact that those letters had not reached Harlan did not mean they had not reached the estate. It meant that the estate's internal management of correspondence had failed to bring them to his attention. This was, legally, a significant distinction, and it was not a distinction in Harlan's favor. Hale made note of it without showing his feelings about it. Oakes asked questions about the delivery records that were answered from documentation. The exchange went on for some time, and at the end of it the notification challenge was not dead, but it was weaker than it had entered the room. There was a pause in the formal exchange while both sides reviewed notes. Water was poured. Eleanor looked at the watercolor on the wall, the painted fields, and thought about nothing in particular. Harlan spoke then, for the first time directly and not through his legal representation. He said, in a clear and steady voice, that he would like to ask Eleanor directly what she intended to do with the claim. Diane Foster made a small movement beside Eleanor, the instinct of a solicitor to manage the channel of communication. But Eleanor put one hand briefly on the table in a gesture that indicated she would answer this herself. She looked at Harlan. She said that she would like to explain what she was willing to accept in a settlement, and that she hoped this would make the path forward clearer for everyone in the room. Harlan said he was listening. She outlined the 3 things she wanted. The first was the formal voiding of the prenuptial agreement, and a settlement that reflected her actual contributions to the estate's finances during the years of the marriage, including her role in restructuring the 2 failing investment companies in the 2nd year, which she could document in detail, and which had saved the estate's commercial portfolio from a significant loss. The second was a formal written acknowledgement of that role, made public and on record, correcting the account that had been given, which was that Harlan had made the relevant adjustments himself. The third was a public statement from Harlan regarding the recent video, not an apology in the dramatic sense, but a clear and honest acknowledgement that his characterization of her at the luncheon had been inaccurate and unfair. In exchange for these 3 things, she said, she would relinquish her claim under the conversion clause, restructure the outstanding debt into a repayment plan over 10 years at a fair interest rate, and conclude all further legal proceedings. She said this without emphasis and without drama. She said it the way she would have laid out any proposal in any business meeting, directly and with the underlying arithmetic already worked through. The room was very quiet when she finished. Harlan's legal team asked for a short recess. Harlan and his solicitors stepped into the corridor. Eleanor remained at the table with Diane Foster and her colleague. She drank her water outside the window. A pigeon was walking along the top of the front garden wall, stopping occasionally to look at nothing, and the recess lasted 14 minutes. When Harlan returned, he sat back down and looked at Eleanor for a moment before speaking. He said that the terms she had described were ones he was prepared to accept. He said it plainly. He did not dress it in language that suggested he was doing her a favor. He did not add qualifications or reservations. He said it, and then he looked at the table, and then he looked back at her, and said that he would like to add one thing. She waited. He said that the acknowledgement she had asked for, the one regarding her role in the business restructuring, was one that he should have made at the time. He said this without being pressed. He said it in the same clear and steady voice he had used to say the rest of it, and she could not tell whether it was because his lawyers had advised him to say it, or because he meant it, and she found, to her mild surprise, that it did not matter very much to her either way. The fact of it being said was sufficient. She nodded. She said that she was glad they had reached an understanding. The rest of the meeting was practical. The The solicitors worked through the specifics of each point, identified the steps required, assigned timelines. The public statement would be drafted jointly. The prenuptial settlement would be calculated by a mutually agreed financial assessor. The debt restructuring terms would be finalized by the following week. It was work, methodical and clear, and it moved forward with the momentum that these things develop when both sides have committed to the same direction. Harlan signed the agreement of intent at the end of the meeting. So did Eleanor. Their signatures appeared on the same page for the first time since the prenuptial agreement they had both signed 8 years ago, and neither of them commented on this. They did not shake hands when the meeting ended. Harlan stood and gathered his papers, and his legal team gathered theirs, and they left the room first. At the door, he paused and looked back at Eleanor, who was still seated, closing her briefcase. He said, with a quietness that carried across the room, that he hoped she was well. She looked up at him. She said that she was. Thank you. He nodded once, then he left. Eleanor remained at the table for a few minutes after everyone else had gone. Diane Foster had stepped out to make a call. The young colleague had gone to find copies of the signed documents. The room was empty and quiet, and the afternoon light was coming in through the sash windows at a low angle, cutting across the long table in a strip of gold. She sat with her hands folded and breathed for a moment. She was not elated. She had not expected to be. Elation was for outcomes that surprised you, and she had not been surprised by anything that happened in this room today. She had known what her offer was worth. She had known that a man facing the realistic prospect of losing his estate would find it reasonable, and she had constructed it to be reasonable, because she had not come back to Ashford to destroy anything. She had come back to correct something. Those were different things, and keeping them different had required a discipline that she had maintained for 7 years. What she felt, sitting in the quiet room with the afternoon light on the table, was something calm and complete. The feeling of a task that had been carried for a long time being set down cleanly. Not triumph. Not vindication. Exactly. Just the clean, specific relief of something being finished properly. She would not be returning to the Ashford estate. What she had no desire to walk through those rooms again. What she had asked for did not include any claim on the house or the grounds. What she had asked for was the acknowledgement of her work, the financial recognition that had been denied her when she left, and the correction of a public dismissal that had been made carelessly and in front of witnesses. Those were the things that had been taken from her. Those were the things she had asked to have returned. She had not asked for more than that. She had been careful about it, because she understood something about settlements that people who have not been in them often do not, which is that the best ones are not the largest ones. The best ones are the ones that address the actual injury precisely, and leave no excess material to fester. She picked up her briefcase. She stood. She went out into the afternoon, which was cool and clear and entirely ordinary. The week that followed the meeting was busy in a practical sense and quiet in every other way. Eleanor worked from her room at the inn, reviewing documents sent by Diane Foster and approving the financial assessor's methodology for calculating the prenuptial settlement and consulting by phone on the debt restructuring terms. The work was detailed and specific, and she gave it her full attention during business hours and set it aside in the evenings. In the evenings she walked. Ashford was not a large town, but it had good walking roads, lanes that ran along field edges and through patches of old woodland, and back into the center from several directions. She had walked these roads during her first visits to Ashford, years ago, when she had been here as a consultant, and the town had been interesting to her as a new place. She walked them now without particular purpose, moving through the autumn air, and letting her mind run freely, or not at all, whichever it chose. She thought sometimes about her father on these walks. George Voss had been a walker. He had believed in it as a discipline, as something that organized the mind without requiring the mind to organize itself. She had inherited this habit without fully understanding why, until she was older, and had come to appreciate what it meant to let thought happen without forcing it. She thought about what she had said to Harlan in the meeting room, and more particularly, about what he had said. She had been truthful when she told Poppy, afterward, that the meeting had gone as expected, but truthful was not the same as complete. And the complete version included the moment when Harlan had looked back from the door and said he hoped she was well, and the particular quietness he had used to say it. She did not attach too much to this, that she was not someone who built narratives from small moments, but she noticed it, in the same careful way she noticed everything, and she filed it in the accurate category, which was simply something real, which she had not expected. The joint statement was drafted over 3 days, with lawyers on both sides reviewing each word with the attention usually reserved for legal contracts. It was published at the end of that week. It appeared first on the Ashford Estates official communications channel, which was read by local press and a wider network of people who had followed the situation with interest since the video clip had spread. It acknowledged Eleanor's role in the estate's financial restructuring during the years of the marriage. It stated clearly, and without qualification, that the description of her at the luncheon had been inaccurate and that it had not reflected her capabilities or her contributions. It was signed by Harlan Ashford. The response online was not dramatic. Some people who had seen the original clip noted the statement. Some made brief comments. A few journalists who had covered the story in the previous weeks filed short follow-up pieces. The conversation moved and shifted and eventually moved on. As conversations do. It did not remake the world. It was a correction in the record, which was all it had been intended to be. Eleanor read the statement when it was published, and then put her phone down and went back to the work she had been doing. If the financial settlement was agreed on the following Tuesday, it was not a number that would have surprised anyone who looked honestly at the documented contributions she had made during the marriage. It was, in fact, lower than what she might have been awarded in a fully contested process. She had not sought the maximum. She had sought the accurate, which was a distinction she had thought about carefully and remained satisfied with. The debt restructuring was signed on the Friday of that week. The terms were straightforward. Voss Capital Partners would receive annual payments over 10 years, at a rate that reflected the current outstanding balance with modest interest. The payments were organized to be manageable for the estate without being symbolic. They were real payments of a real debt. Nothing was forgiven. Nothing was inflated. It was what it was. With the signing of the restructuring agreement, the conversion clause was formally relinquished. The Ashford estate remained in Harlan Ashford's name. The 4,000 acres and the house on the hill and the oak trees on the drive were his, as they had always appeared to be, and would now continue to be in fact, rather than just in appearance. The difference was invisible from the outside. The people of Ashford who had watched the situation with interest, which was most of them, had varying reactions to how it had resolved. Some felt that the outcome was softer than Harlan deserved. Some felt that Eleanor had been more than fair. Some had opinions that said more about their prior feelings about the people involved than about anything they actually understood of the details. The details had not been made fully public, and the solicitors on both sides had been clear about what could and could not be shared. What was public was the statement and the general shape of the settlement, not its specifics. Audrey Crane, who heard things without asking because that was how things worked in a small town, said nothing about any of it. She brought Eleanor's tea in the mornings and cleared her table in the evenings, and mentioned once, very briefly, that she thought Eleanor had handled herself well. Eleanor thanked her and meant it. Poppy had developed, over the course of Eleanor's stay, a quiet and genuine admiration that she expressed by doing her job particularly well, and occasionally leaving a small pastry on Eleanor's breakfast tray without being asked. Eleanor appreciated this more than she said. On the morning of Eleanor's last day in Ashford, she came downstairs to find both Audrey and Poppy at the front desk together, which was unusual, and a small wrapped parcel on the counter that turned out to contain a tin of the local tea that she had mentioned once, in passing, was particularly good. She stood with the tin in her hands and felt something warm and uncomplicated, which was a pleasant sensation. She said goodbye to both of them with the genuine warmth of someone who has been well looked after and knows the value of that. She gave Audrey the name of a good financial consultant in the city, unprompted, because she had noticed during her stay that the inn's bookkeeping system had several inefficiencies that a professional could fix in a day, and that Audrey would benefit from knowing. Audrey wrote down the name and thanked her with a practicality that Eleanor respected. She carried her bag out to the car that was waiting to take her to the station. The morning was pale and cool, the kind of autumn morning that looks like a photograph of itself, very still and very clear. She looked up at the hill as she got into the car. The Ashford estate was visible in the morning light, the house solid on the hill, the oak trees dark beside the drive. She looked at it for a moment. It looked exactly as it always had, as it had on the day she arrived, and as it had on the day she left the first time, 7 years ago, with a modest settlement and a quiet instruction to say nothing. She had said nothing, for 7 years. And then she had come back and she had said, in precise and documented terms, what needed to be said, and it had been heard. She looked at the hill for one more moment. Then she got into the car and looked forward. The drive to the station took 12 minutes. She used them to review a set of notes for a meeting she had the following morning in the city. A new deal, a new company in difficulty, a new set of numbers to understand and address. The station was quiet at that hour. She bought a coffee and stood on the platform and drank it while she waited. The train came in on time and she boarded and found her seat and set her briefcase on the rack above. As the train pulled out of Ashford Station and the town began to slip away behind the windows, she did not look back. She opened her notes and continued reading, preparing for the morning meeting, thinking about the work ahead. She had always been someone who looked forward. The journalist who eventually pieced together the full story was a woman named Helen Marsh, who worked for a national publication and who had been alerted to the Ashford situation by the original video clip, the way most journalists who covered it had been. Helen had gone further than most. She had dug into the property records, found references to the original loan agreement in documents that had been registered but not widely noticed, traced the ownership history of Voss Capital Partners, and eventually, through careful and persistent inquiry, assembled a picture that was substantially more complete than anything that had been published so far. She reached Eleanor by phone on a Wednesday evening, 3 weeks after Eleanor had returned to the city from Ashford. She introduced herself and explained what she had put together, and said she believed it was a significant story that deserved to be told accurately, and that she would prefer to tell it with Eleanor's input than without it. Eleanor had been in situations like this before, not with this particular story, but with the general dynamic of someone who has found a thread and is pulling it and wants permission and context. She listened to Helen Marsh describe what she had found, and she asked 2 questions. The first was whether Helen had confirmed all of it independently. Helen said she had confirmed the property records and the company ownership and the loan agreement. Eleanor said that was accurate. The second question was what Helen intended to do with the story if Eleanor declined to comment. Helen said she would publish what she had confirmed and note that Eleanor had declined to discuss it. Eleanor said she would speak to Helen on one condition. The condition was that the story be told accurately and without embellishment, which meant not making her into someone she was not. She said she had not spent 7 years planning anything. She had spent 7 years doing her work, and the situation had arrived at the point it arrived at because of the choices made by various people at various times, and she did not want to be presented as some kind of mastermind. She said that real situations were almost never as clean as dramatic narratives required them to be, and that she would only cooperate if Helen was willing to reflect that complexity. Helen Marsh said that was exactly what she was interested in. They spoke for an hour and a half. Eleanor answered every question with the same directness she brought to everything. She was precise about what she had done and what she had intended and what she had felt, without excess and without performance. She said that the settlement had been fair and that she was satisfied with it. She said that the marriage had been complicated in the way that all real relationships were complicated, and that she did not believe in presenting Harlan Ashford as a pure villain any more than she had presented herself as an uncomplicated victim. She said that people made decisions with the information and the character they had at the time, and that the record was the record. When Helen asked about the moment of the meeting, the room with the long table and the afternoon light and the moment when Harlan had said he hoped she was well, Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She said that she had no particular comment on that moment. Helen said she understood. The article was published on a Sunday. It was the lead feature in the magazine section, and it was long and careful, and it presented the full arc of the story, the loan agreement, and the years of Eleanor's work at the firm, and the return to Ashford, and the meeting and the settlement, with the accuracy that Helen had promised. It did not make Eleanor into a symbol. It did not make Harlan into a monster. It presented 2 people, a set of documents, a series of decisions, and a resolution. It was read by a very large number of people. Eleanor did not track the numbers. She knew the article was out because Diane Foster sent her a message that morning saying it was well written, and because her office received an unusual number of calls that week from people who wanted to speak with her for various reasons, most of which were professional inquiries, and some of which were simply people who had read the article and wanted to say something to her. She was not entirely sure what. The question Helen had asked, toward the end of their conversation, was the one that had stayed with Eleanor. Helen had asked, with the directness of a good journalist who knows when to be direct, what would she want people to take from the story? Eleanor had thought about this for a genuine moment before answering. She had said, she would want them to notice that the most important things she did were not dramatic, but she had learned her work carefully. She had maintained her records. She had read documents that most people in her position would not have read, and she had understood what those documents meant, and she had waited until the time was right to act on that understanding. None of that was exciting. None of it made for a particularly compelling scene, but it was the thing that had made everything else possible. She had said, competence is not glamorous, but it is reliable, and in the end, reliability is worth considerably more than glamour. Helen Marsh had written that down carefully. It appeared, near the end of the article, in the same plain language in which Eleanor had said it. It was, of all the things written about the situation, the sentence that was quoted most often by the people who wrote about the article and shared it and discussed it in the weeks that followed. It was the sentence that appeared in the subject lines of emails sent to Eleanor from strangers, emails from women in difficult situations who had read it and felt that something in it addressed something they were carrying. Eleanor read those emails. She answered some of them. She did not make a practice of it because her time was finite and her work was demanding and she was not a figure who sought a platform. But she answered the ones that seemed to her to be written by people who genuinely needed to hear from her, and she answered them in the same plain and direct language she used for everything. She said, "Do your work carefully. Keep your records. Do not make decisions under pressure that should be made with time. Do not mistake other people's certainty about you for fact. And do not, under any circumstances, sign a document without having it reviewed by someone whose only interest is yours." That last piece of advice she gave more than once and with particular emphasis. She was not a person who believed in dwelling. She had taken what she needed from the Ashford chapter, which was the settlement and the acknowledgement, and she had left the rest there, which is where it belonged. The work in the city was interesting and the new deal was complex in ways that kept her genuinely engaged, and her team was growing, and the firm her father had built was in better shape than it had ever been. She went to her father's grave on the first Sunday of the month. It was a habit she had kept since he died. She would stand there for a few minutes and say whatever seemed appropriate, she had told him. That October, about what had happened in Ashford. She had told him about the registry office, and the meeting, and the settlement. She had told him about the article. She had said, "You were right about documentation." She had said it with affection and a certain amount of humor, because George Voss had said it to her many times over many years, in the way that a careful person repeats the things they know to be true, until the people they love know them too. She had said, "You kept everything. You kept the loan agreement and the correspondence and all of it, in the filing cabinet, and you never threw anything away because you understood that facts are only useful if they can be proven." The wind had moved through the trees at the edge of the cemetery while she stood there. It was a cool morning, the kind that smelled of wood smoke and wet leaves. She had said, "Thank you for all of it." She had stood there a moment longer, in the quiet, with the wind moving through the trees. Then she had gone back to her car and driven to the office, because there was a meeting at 11 and she did not like to be late. Eleanor did not think of what happened in Ashford as a victory. This was not modesty, and it was not the performance of modesty, which is a different thing. It was an accurate description of how the situation felt to her when she looked at it honestly. A victory was something you celebrated, something with an edge of triumph to it, something that came with a clear sense of winning against someone who had lost. What she had done in Ashford did not feel like that. What it felt like was a correction, the way a calculation that has carried an error for years feels when the error is finally identified and fixed and the numbers reconcile. The numbers had reconciled. That was the truest way she knew how to say it. Harlan Ashford had continued his life. She knew this in the way that you know things about people who exist in the same world you do without being in contact with them. The estate was still there. The oak trees still stood on the drive. The first annual payment of the debt restructuring had been made on time and without incident, which Diane Foster had confirmed with a brief message. Whether Harlan had changed in any meaningful way she could not know, and did not spend time trying to determine. People changed or they did not, and whether they did was their own business in the end, and the project of monitoring someone else's change was not one she was interested in taking on. Cecile Ashford had given an interview to a society publication that said, in careful and unrevealing language, that the recent situation had been a complex one, and that Harlan was a man who took his responsibilities seriously. Eleanor had read this and thought, all right, that was fine. Cecile was navigating what she was navigating, and how she did it was her own affair. The people in Ashford continued to talk about the situation in the way that small towns talk about the things that have happened within them, with a mix of accurate and inaccurate detail that calcified gradually into local history. Future visitors to Ashford who asked about the estate would be told various versions of the story, some of which bore a recognizable relationship to the facts, and some of which had drifted considerably. This was, Eleanor understood, simply how stories move through the world, and there was no point in trying to correct it unless a specific and important inaccuracy needed addressing. Her own story, the one she carried and knew to be true, was the only version she was responsible for. She had been a young woman who came to a town and fell in love, and trusted that trust, and was disappointed by it. She had left with less than she deserved, and with a quiet instruction to be silent. She had been silent for 7 years, not because she was afraid, but because she had not yet found the right language for what needed to be said. The language had turned out to be documents and clauses and the precise and careful weight of law. She had used it as well as she knew how. She had not destroyed anything. She had not sought to humiliate anyone. She had asked for what was accurate, and she had received it. The rest she had let go. There was a moment, several months after she returned from Ashford, when she was sitting in a meeting in the city, and someone in the meeting said something dismissive about her analysis, the kind of thing that happens in rooms full of people with competing interests. A throwaway comment that was meant to signal that her contribution was not quite at the level required. She noticed it, she let the meeting continue, and when her turn came she presented her analysis in the same clear and well-ordered language she always used, and the numbers she had prepared were correct, which they always were, and the meeting moved in the direction her analysis had pointed. Afterward, a younger colleague caught up with her in the corridor and said, hesitantly, that he had noticed what had been said earlier and that he thought she had handled it well. She said thank you, and she meant it. He said, "Does it bother you when people underestimate you?" She considered this question with the genuine attention it deserved. She said, "It used to. Now it mostly just gives me information." He thought about this for a moment. She went back to her office. There was a report to review and 2 calls in the afternoon, and a set of figures to approve before the day ended. She sat down at her desk and opened the first file and began to read. The oak trees in Ashford would be losing their leaves now. She had seen them in autumn once before, years ago, standing on the drive with her coat around her, and Harlan beside her, both of them looking at the trees and saying nothing in particular, just standing in the same place at the same time, the way people do when they are happy and do not yet know that happiness will not last. She let that image be what it was, a real memory, a true thing that had happened, belonging to a chapter that was closed. She turned the page. The figures were detailed and required concentration. She gave them everything she had, which was, as it had always been, more than enough. Outside the window of her office, the city went about its ordinary afternoon, full of people moving through their days with their own unshared histories, their own corrections still waiting to be made, their own documents filed in cabinets in rooms they had not yet thought to open. The world was full of things like that, she had come to understand, full of facts waiting quietly to be found. She had found hers. She had done what needed to be done with it. She was satisfied, not triumphant, not bitter, not waiting for anything. She was simply a woman at her desk, doing her work, at the beginning of a new chapter, in a life that was entirely and exactly her own.